This is probably the type of video where you'll want tea or coffee and some biscuits. A couple of years ago, I decided that I was going to read all of Stephen King's works in chronological order. This I have not done. In fact, I read the first 21 of Stephen King's published works, and I want to be clear as I'm going through this video and ranking these according to my personal preferences, which you may disagree with, and that's fine. I want to just say that they do include the Richard Bachman books, and when I talk about Stephen King's early works, I mean the books up to, but not including, it. And we're starting at the bottom. So, in at number 22 is Thinner. This, as you know, is not technically a Stephen King book. This is a book that he published under his pseudonym, Richard Bachman, and this is actually the last book he published under that name before the world found out that Richard Bachman is Stephen King. I don't think it says anything particularly interesting. It seems to be trying to say something interesting in the way that the white male protagonist perceives a very different type of person and different types of people. It explores the way that this particular protagonist, who is not likable, is not supposed to be likable, is going through a pretty horrific experience and what that does to him. I did an entire video about Thinner actually, and I'll put a card up there if you want to watch that, where I compare Thinner with Lovecraft Country, which is a much more superior horror novel that deals with race. If you're interested in a horror novel that is genuinely horrific, that is looking at race in an interesting way, Lovecraft Country does that, as does the TV series, by the way. Thinner does not. I think what's particularly disappointing about Thinner is the other Richard Bachman books are all better. And, you know, this was published in, I think, 1985, by which point, you know, King has been writing for a long time, and I think he just should be a better writer at this point. But I think that Thinner is very weak material. Christine, this is the book about the killer car. It's told from the perspective of one of the teenage protagonists. The teenagers in this are like, they're written in a way that's like, they're from the perspective of somebody writing about teenagers, but he's a middle-aged man writing about teenagers, which is what Stephen King was by this point. He was, so I think, well into his 30s. Probably my age, come to think of it. But as with many Stephen King, not all Stephen King books, but as with many Stephen King books, the female characters are very badly written. And the book itself is bloated. It's a big book. I don't know how, in terms of number of pages, it must be pushing about 500 pages. But the story is not complicated. There's this car that has a mind of its own. It comes into possession of a teenage boy. It sort of takes over his personality, and his friends decide that they have to do something about this. That's kind of it. I don't think it's particularly interesting. I thought that it ran out of road very quickly. Sorry. At number 20, and this is a book I DNF'd, which is why I feel a bit weird including it in this list, because, you know, I didn't read the whole thing, so can I really judge it? Well, yes, I am going to judge it. The Talisman is number 20 in this list. I gave up after maybe 100 pages or so. This is a big book, and after 100 pages I was really bored. I didn't really feel like I was going anywhere, and I didn't really feel as though I was doing anything particularly interesting in this kind of fantasy, high fantasy genre, I feel like, that he was writing about. I couldn't connect with the main character. There's this sort of younger teenage boy. I just didn't know who this kid was in any way. He's this kind of archetype of being a sort of a chosen one figure in this kind of other world that exists. But I didn't like him. I couldn't connect with him. I couldn't really connect with the world that was being created. Maybe I should have given it more time, but I thought this was really, really boring, and so I DNF'd it, but I didn't want to put it last in the list because I DNF'd it. Number 19 in this list is Cujo. Cujo? Anyway, this is the book. We just talked about a book about a killer car. This is a book about a killer dog. There's like a Family Guy sketch, I think, where they kind of cut to Stephen King pitching his latest book.
Okay, for my 307th book, this couple is attacked by a lamp monster. Ooh.
You're not even trying anymore, are you?
I think he's at this phase in his career here where he's just taking things and making them sinister. Killer car, killer dog. So yeah, this is the killer dog book. The reason I put it higher than Christine is because this is a much shorter book. I think it's only like 200 to 300 pages. It is quite short, mercifully short. Again, female characters, very badly written. Male characters, unlikable. The most likable character is the dog. Not because the dog is killing the characters I don't like, but because early on the dog is, you know, a normal dog and then becomes infected with something that makes it a crazy dog. And I really liked the sequences that were from the perspective of the dog. I felt quite sorry for the dog, you know, as this dog was sort of losing its mind. I felt that it should have had more of a supernatural element. That's kind of what I was expecting. I guess I was expecting like haunted dog, but it was not haunted dog. It was just crazy dog. And it's mostly like crazy dog menacing a mother and her child trapped in a car. And that's kind of like, that makes up a large chunk of the book. And then there's just a kind of fairly depressing, low-key end to it. It felt like a short story / novella that perhaps tipped a little too far into novel category. It didn't suffer from the same sins as Christine in that it was like way too long, but maybe just something that might have worked better as a short story. I don't know. At number 18, this is another Richard Bachman book, and it's called Rage. This is quite notorious, Rage. I have a collection that includes this, but I think the modern collections of the Bachman books, I don't think you can get this one. It's notorious because it's about a school shooting, and for years King defended this, you know, saying that he was essentially making like a free speech argument for it. I think eventually he decided that he wanted to withdraw it from publication, perhaps in response to just the increase in the number of school shootings in the US. I don't think that this glorifies school shootings, and it's, I mean, technically it is a school shooting, but it's not a school shooting massacre. There are, I think, 1 or 2 deaths at the start, and then it's mostly just a classroom that is being taken hostage by one of the students, and there's this kind of long, rambling discussion that takes place between the student and his classmates, and then there's a kind of an orgy of violence at the end. It's juvenilia. I mean, King wrote this when he was quite young. I think maybe he was in college or maybe even before that. He was very young when he wrote this. And I don't really know what he's trying to say, really. I don't know if he knew what he was trying to say. So I haven't put it like right at the bottom of my list because I don't feel like it's as bad as the reputation that it has. But also the reputation it has makes you think that there's something very subversive about it. I don't think so either. I don't think it's particularly subversive or troubling. It's just a little confused. At number 17, and this is the last book chronologically that I read, and this is Skeleton Crew. This is one of King's short story collections, and there is another short story collection in this list, and Skeleton Crew is inferior to that one by quite a lot. I did include Skeleton Crew in one of my worst books of 2020 list. I think part of the reason for that is because I just read so much Stephen King by the time I got to Skeleton Crew that maybe I was just a little over Stephen King by that point. But there aren't really stories in this collection that like really stand out to me. I mean, The Mist is good, but I'd already seen The Mist, the movie, which is a really good movie. And of course, the thing about the movie is that it has an ending which is actually far better than the one in the book. And as for the other stories, I can't even remember most of them. So I've put this one lower down just because I think they weren't particularly memorable stories. It's quite lengthy. There's definitely a few that I think you could have cut out of this. There are a few B-sides. So all in all, meh. Number 16 is Roadwork, and this is another Richard Bachman book. Roadwork is about a guy who he's been told that he has to move out of his house because there's going to be some new development, and he refuses, and I think everybody around him is moving out, but he's kind of staying put. And over the course of the story, his life is sort of spiraling out of control. The relationships he has with those around him are falling apart, and you can see that things are getting to a bad place with this guy, and he's getting to the point where he doesn't really care anymore. It's interesting. What I like about this one is that there's this kind of sense of escalating chaos and how everything is falling apart. And I quite like that. I quite like the way that Stephen King does that. You kind of see that things are not right, and you know, this guy just needs to make some smart choices, but he's not, and he knows that he's not, and he's almost sort of embracing that. And you really feel that as a reader, you know? And I think it resonates with, you know, the modern day, really, particularly with people who feel like society has left them behind and they don't want to play the game. And these people can be kind of frightening and dangerous from a certain perspective. But also they're making a legitimate point in that the way that society is moving forward, that the way that the capitalist system is operating is not working for everybody. It is alienating people, and I think King/Bachman conveys a sense of that alienation in Roadwork. He conveys a sense of a kind of a rage in Roadwork that he doesn't do very effectively in Rage, actually. So I think this is a much better work than Rage. At number 15, and some of you might be surprised at this, that this has come so low down, but at number 15 is The Dead Zone. There's a very good movie adaptation of The Dead Zone with Christopher Walken. It features this kind of Trump-like character, this politician who probably shouldn't be in a position of power, but is very good at obtaining that power. And our protagonist is somebody who can see into the future, and he sees the implications of this particular individual taking power. He gets his powers as a result of an accident that he suffers towards the start of the book. That sequence at the beginning, where he goes to the fairground on a date and the accident happens, it's a really good sequence. I remember being really tense as I was reading it. And he starts to get these visions, but then as it goes on, I think partly because I'd already seen the film, so I kind of knew what was coming. So I just found her a little boring. So maybe this suffers from the fact that I was getting a little tired of Stephen King by the time I read it, and the fact I'd already watched the film. And I think maybe that affected my ability to enjoy it as much as perhaps I might have if I didn't know anything about The Dead Zone. It's still a good book, but if you've already seen the film, maybe you won't enjoy it as much. At number 14 is The Cycle of the Werewolf, and this is an interesting one. It's quite short and it's quite heavily illustrated, and it's really more of a novella. It's like a series of short interlinked short stories, and each short story is a month of the year, and you're following what is happening in this town where there is a werewolf, and you don't know who is turning into the werewolf until kind of right towards the end of the book. I really enjoyed this. I'd read a few fairly negative reviews about it, that people didn't think it was a particularly good werewolf story. I mean, it's not doing anything massively new, but I think it's quite different. I think just the illustrations are really cool, and I enjoyed the story, so I thought this was perfectly fine. And I think you can get away with being perfectly fine when you're doing something quite short. So this one is kind of in the middle of the pack, really, in terms of my ranking here, Cycle of the Werewolf. I recommend checking it out if you can. At number 13, and it is The Running Man. Now, if you've seen the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, the book is nothing like that movie. They're completely different things.
It's showtime.
They bear a similarity in that they're both kind of set in this dystopian future, and there's a game where people volunteer to be hunted. But in the film, the Arnold Schwarzenegger film, it's more like it's like a game show kind of thing where he goes into this. There's a particular venue where it happens, and it's very stylized. Whereas in the book, it's just like you're out in the world, the normal world, and you just have to try and survive. And there are just these people that are hunting you down, trying to kill you. And like in the film, in the book, the protagonist sort of gets the upper hand, but it ends on a much darker note than the film. And again, it creates this escalating sense of chaos and nihilism and a sense of this world, albeit a made-up world, that is just kind of falling apart. So The Running Man, out of the Bachman books, this is one of the better ones. I really recommend this one, and it's been a long time since I've seen the movie. I know it's very different, but I might check that one out again just for a laugh. At number 12, this is another collection, although it's a collection of novellas rather than a collection of short stories, and there's 4 of them, and each one is sort of, I guess, meant to be emblematic of a particular season. It's quite a famous collection because this one contains The Body, which was adapted into the movie Stand By Me, and it includes Shawshank Redemption. I enjoyed reading it. I mean, it's strong material, particularly those 2 works. There's another one that I think was adapted into a movie by Bryan Singer about this old man who used to be in the Nazi party, but he's kind of hidden there, and his neighbor, who's this teenage kid, he finds out about the guy's past and he blackmails him, and there's this sort of weird relationship between the 2 of them. I didn't think that was very good. And then there's one at the end that's more of a gothic tale that I thought was quite good. And then of course, Shawshank Redemption and The Body / Stand By Me are, they're great stories. So overall, this is good material. One dud. I think the other thing that lets it down is the Shawshank Redemption and Stand By Me are such famous films, and so many people have seen them, that you're probably more likely to have seen the films before you read the books, which was the case with me as well. I wouldn't say that the films are superior to the material, like they're quite similar. So if you enjoyed the films, you will enjoy the books, I think, but I don't think you'll get anything new from reading the books either. At number 11 is The Dark Tower, or number 1 in the Dark Tower series, basically, which is the Gunslinger. So this is kind of what began this whole great saga, really, of the Dark Tower, and this is the only one I've read. I have not yet read any of the other ones because I never got to that point in the chronology. And it's a good opening. It's a really interesting concept. It's very different to other things Stephen King has done, but this is sort of blends different genres because it has a spaghetti western style. It has this fantasy style. He's creating this whole universe here that he sort of interweaves into bits of his other books as well. And it's a good story. It feels like almost like a series of interconnected short stories, and I think maybe they were published separately then brought together into this volume. Correct me if I'm wrong. And it's kind of fairly well written, and it's definitely something where you want to read more, so I'm really interested in reading more from the series. And the characters are interesting, and the setting is interesting, and it's just an interesting world that he's sort of dipping into this kind of fairly short first volume in this series. So we're definitely getting into the good stuff now. From hearing myself talking about this one, I feel like we're starting to get into the good stuff, and the Gunslinger is some of the good stuff. At number 10 is The Eyes of the Dragon. I was a bit worried I was going to find this quite boring because, I DNF'd the Talisman, which I think I did before I read this. And I hadn't read a lot about The Eyes of the Dragon, but I put this in my top 10 because I really liked it. I really thought it was interesting. It's like a court intrigue kind of thing. It has a kind of this sort of pseudo-medieval setting. With sort of elements of fantasy. It's something that is linked, albeit obliquely, to the Dark Tower universe. I think that perhaps the link becomes more apparent as the Dark Tower series continues. And I just enjoyed it. I thought it was a good story, and I just liked that kind of court intrigue setting. You really feel for the protagonist and the kind of the difficulties he's going through. I like the way that the whole thing was resolved, and it's a world that I like with the Gunslinger. It's a world that I would quite like to have revisited. I think it's quite interesting. In at number 9, and it is The Shining. People quite often will cite this, as the best Stephen King book. I think it's definitely probably his most famous book. I'd say maybe The Shining, in part because of the movie. And this is what makes it complicated, because there was a movie that was made of this by Stanley Kubrick, starring Jack Nicholson. It's a very famous movie. It's a very good movie. Some people have difficulty with it. I was lucky enough to see it in the cinema a few years ago. They were kind of re-showing it in the cinema, and I was just bowled over by the sound and the spectacle of it. In terms of a sheer kind of cinematic experience, The Shining is incredible. Stephen King doesn't like the Stanley Kubrick version because it differs in many ways from the book. One significant way being the characterization of the protagonist / antagonist, anti-hero, Jack Torrance, who in the book is meant to be a sympathetic character at the start, but then, becomes less sympathetic and becomes a fallen character by the end. I disagree with that. I disagree with King's assessment of his own character, because I don't like Jack Torrance from the start, because from the start he's introduced to us as someone who serially abuses children. He has physically abused a boy at the school he teaches at, and he's physically abused his own son. So he's a serial child abuser, and he's not particularly nice to his wife either. So I just don't think he's like a particularly likable person from the start when you know this kind of information. So to say that we're supposed to sympathize with him and this kind of plight he's going through, that he's fighting this kind of inner battle that he loses with this hotel that he's looking after, I don't buy it. He's not a nice guy. So that undermines a lot of it for me, but it still works sort of like as a story, and the setting of this hotel, which is kind of haunted, but not really. It's more like an evil hotel that he has to look after with his family. They're completely isolated, and he's sort of going mad through the course of the book. It's told really well. It's really interesting. It's one of Stephen King's very first books. I think it was his third novel. When I read this as a teenager, it scared the crap out of me. But reading it now as an adult, it's not the paranormal aspect that grips me. It is the characterization of the people and of the place. I think the characterization of the place fascinates me more than scares me now. But still, I could say a lot about The Shining. In some ways, it has some kind of serious issues with characterization. In others, it succeeds wonderfully. At number 8 is a book that I liked more as I thought about it after I read it than I did as I was reading it. And that's Pet Sematary. This is again cited as one of Stephen King's best books. And as I was reading it, I thought, oh, here we go again. Badly written female characters. A story that is dragging on. But it's an interesting book because the end is so extreme in many ways, Pet Sematary, and it's all building to that. And it has to do what it does prior to that for the ending, for that conclusion to work and to have the impact that it does. Basic idea here is that there is a young family that moves into a house and there's a pet cemetery that's off the back of the property. And there's some area beyond the pet cemetery that is mysterious and sinister. And the nature of that place is what dictates what happens at the end of this book. And like some of those Bachman books, this also has that sense of this kind of chaos unfolding, of things just falling apart, and you can kind of see it happening, and there's kind of nothing that can be done about it in a way. And I think once I got over my frustration with a kind of a somewhat slow first half or so of the book, once you get through that first half and you read the second half and you can see why it's structured in the way that it is, I think it does succeed. It has such a strong ending, and that's not always the case with Stephen King's books. Some of them start very well and they fall flat. This is kind of the other way around, and it starts slowly, but it has a big wallop at the end. It's one I think I'd like to reread at some point for that reason. I think I might enjoy it more the second time around. So at number 8, Pet Sematary. At number 7, and this is a book that I think is remarkable just because it was written so early in Stephen King's career, and that is The Stand. This is an enormous book. The first version of this book that came out was a bit shorter than a subsequent version, and some people think the added material in the later version doesn't add that much. Other people think actually it really enhances it. I'd like to read the later version to read more of that. But this is an incredible achievement. This is an epic horror book, one in which we see the apocalypse unfold and we see what happens after the apocalypse has happened. And it spans, vast areas of the United States. It is a story in a sense about the United States. It's kind of like King trying to get to grips with his country, kind of trying to get to grips with the different forces at play, the different societal forces at play in the country, and what underpins those, so these ideas of spirituality and faith, good and evil. He's really grasping big ideas and doing it through a story which is captivating. One that does sag somewhat in the middle. It has a very strong start and it has a strong end, and it sort of starts to lose its way a bit in the middle, and then it kind of finds its way again towards the end. But never less than interesting and occasionally horrific, and populated with characters who... I don't think any of the characters are badly written characters. I think there are some that are better written than others. But I don't get that kind of misogyny that you see in some of the other King works, where I think he just doesn't put enough thought into the way he's portraying women. And you are getting a sense of purpose here. This isn't just some throwaway idea like kill a car and kill a dog that he builds a world around. He's already got that world here, and he's already got interesting characters populating that world. It's kind of all here. And there is just some incredible sequences in this that I still remember even now. In at number 6, and chronologically, this is the very first. This was King's first book, and of course, it's Carrie. Again, one of his most famous ones. By far his strongest female character in any of his books that I've read. Carrie herself is interesting in so many ways. She is a sympathetic character, but she's also character with terrifying powers who does not use those powers for good. You're seeing this story develop from multiple different perspectives using different styles. I think part of the reason King is doing that is because he doesn't have enough confidence as a writer, I think, so early on to just write the story straight, so he's kind of embellishing it with all these different perspectives. But it sort of works here, and I particularly like the bits that are from Carrie's perspective, as she's trying to understand what is happening to her, something that's causing her confusion, his sense of self-pity, but then a growing confidence, and then how that confidence is crushed and her response to that, and the devastating consequences that has for the world around her. It's a really interesting book, and as a debut novel, you can understand why this made Stephen King so famous, because there were few horror novels that had been written in this way about this particular type of person and this particular type of place. Okay, here we go, top 5. Number 5, and this is actually a non-fiction Stephen King book, and it's called Danse Macabre. And I don't think people talk about this one very much, and it's a bit of a strange one to include. It's where Stephen King is talking about, I guess, horror literature in the broadest sense that has influenced him. So it's kind of like Stephen King goes to the movies and Stephen King goes to the bookstore and he's telling you what he likes there and what has influenced him. And I just really liked reading that. I really liked, after having read so many Stephen King books by the time I got to this one, I liked getting into his head a bit more and understanding what drives him, what interests him. Particularly because he's talking about a lot of works that I'd never heard of before, that I was not very familiar with. So if you do want to understand, if you are a Stephen King fan and you want to understand more about what drives him, what motivates him, and what else is out there that you might like, then this is a really great book to read. At number 4, and I'd said earlier, I think that there's a Stephen King sort of story collection that I think from his earlier works is the best of his collections, and that's Night Shift. Night Shift is quite an early work. It's like his 4th or 5th or maybe 6th publication or something, and it's very kind of pulpy. It has a lot of almost like Twilight Zone type stories, you know, really kind of creepy crawly tales in many ways, or like killer rats or things like that. And why I love this so much is because Stephen King is doing here with a short story and succeeding things that he does sometimes in lengthier works and they don't succeed. So this collection has something about killer cars, and it's great. It's short, it's pulpy, and you can just enjoy it for like eating junk food, you know? But then Christine is like, oh, do I want like 500 pages about a killer car? There weren't really many or even any duds in it. It's just a great time. Night Shift is just great fun if you just want a kind of a pulpy, enjoyable collection of horror short stories written by a writer at the top of his game. Then read Night Shift. I think it's fantastic. So the top 3, and number 3 is actually another Bachman book, the one I haven't talked about yet, and that is The Long Walk. Is it fair to say that this is like an underrated book? I think a few people have said like how fantastic this is. But like if you've read some Stephen King, I guess you probably haven't read The Long Walk. You really should. It's not a paranormal book. It's set in the near future and it's about these teenagers. I think they're all teenage boys and they have to walk a very long way and they have to keep walking. And if they stop walking, they get 3 warnings. Or if they slow down beneath a certain speed, they get 3 warnings. And then there's no 4th warning, they're shot dead. And whoever is still walking at the end is the winner. It's like this horrific idea, and you can see the inspiration, for example, for the Hunger Games in here, and so many of these dystopian YA books and films. Battle Royale, another one. But here he is writing this story, this particular idea, very early on. I think this came out in the 1970s or maybe the early 80s. It's from the perspective of one of the walkers, and you feel the exhaustion and that kind of underlying terror, but also that kind of competitiveness as well. It's like taking that kind of teenage world of that kind of competitiveness and insecurity and terror and how the outside world is so unfair, and then putting it into this kind of extreme situation. And I loved it. I love being on this journey and in a way you don't want it to end, but at the same time you do want it to end, because by not ending it's doing this horrible thing to these kids. So if you like YA dystopia, something like Hunger Games, then you'll love The Long Walk. At number 2 is also the second book chronologically that was published, and that's Salem's Lot. And I read a lot of it on a super long haul flight when we still did those things. I was traveling from New Zealand, where I live now, back to the UK, which is where I'm from, and we were flying over India, and there was a storm. There was lightning flying around. Well, it was kind of in the distance, but I could see the lightning, and I was reading Salem's Lot and looking out and seeing that it was nighttime, and I was seeing this lightning and the storms, and it created such an atmosphere as I was reading it. I love this book. In terms of just a pure horror novel, just that experience of just reading pure horror. And the protagonist is not particularly interesting. Some of the characters are kind of interesting. A lot of them are not. But the sense of place, not just the town, but the house. There's a haunted house, and he develops this idea of this evil place in The Shining. So as a vampire's tale, it does something new in that it's taking it into small town America, and he just does it so well. You can see this kind of creeping dread, this creeping horror that is kind of moving through the town, that is infecting the town. It's taking over, but at the same time there was a kind of an evil that was already there. It was fertile ground for this thing, this horror that is invited itself in. In terms of a pure novel and a brilliant vampire story, you wouldn't do much better than this. Number one might be a surprise to some people, because I don't think this is often cited as Stephen King's best early book. I thought it was brilliant. Firestarter. Why did I like Firestarter? I like Firestarter because it's relentless. From start to finish, you were gripped. It's almost like it's a book of two halves, right? And the first half is almost like an extended chase sequence. But the person being chased is the one who should probably be chasing, because the person or the people being chased, they're very powerful, but they're fleeing from people who want to use their power and exploit their power and study it. The second half is, slight spoiler here, those two powerful people are captured, they're incarcerated. And the second half is more of a psychological horror, because one of the main characters, there's a girl, and she has the ability to set things on fire, hence Firestarter, just using her mind. And there is a character who is trying to emotionally control her, emotionally manipulate her, because they know that they can't dominate her. She has a power that is terrifying and can be used at any given moment. And so he is essentially emotionally abusing her. And you're sort of seeing this happen. And the character, the antagonist who's doing this, is such an interesting character as well. I think he's one of Stephen King's greatest villains in my view, because he thinks his way through the problem and he just very slowly creeps into her world. And then it has a kind of an explosive ending. It's, like I said, it's relentless, it's well written, it's just got this kind of compulsive energy, kinetic if you like. And I really found the characters interesting. There are a lot of similarities between the girl in Firestarter and with Carrie. These are both young women who are vulnerable and they are at risk of exploitation or being exploited, but they discover a strength within themselves, and that strength can be deadly. But I think in Firestarter, it is harnessed in a way that liberates this character in a way that I don't think it liberates Carrie. I think it is her doom in a way, as it is the doom of those around her. Firestarter to me has everything you want from a Stephen King book. It has this kind of simple, basic idea, which is a girl who can set things alight with her mind. But then it tells a story around that is compulsive, and that populates it with a cast of characters who have these fascinating relationships with each other. There is a father-daughter relationship, there is abuser-abused, there's sinister government agency, there are people fighting for control, there are people who are fighting for control of power in very different ways. It's not a scary book, it's more of an action-packed book, but it's a book that is doing something interesting with the characters, doing something interesting with the relationship between these characters, and saying something interesting about power and the need for power and the exploitation of power. It doesn't have that sense of place that Stephen King is so good at and that he does so well in something like Salem's Lot. It has so much else that I think recommends it, that for me, the best book that Stephen King wrote in his early career, the best early career Stephen King book, is Firestarter. And that's it. We've made it to the end. That is 22 Stephen King books ranked. What did you think of my ranking? Do you think that I'm like way off? I'm sure you do. This is just my opinion. And what would you have put as the best of these early Stephen King books, and what would you have put as the worst? Let me know in the comments box down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Give it a thumbs up if you did, and please subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate that. And I will see you guys very soon. Take care. Bye.